But it's different now because there's a new government in Israel, which is quite different from the earlier ones. It's a government which basically says, we've got God on our side, so we don't care what you think. Well, when you have that kind of government, it becomes unpredictable. Ben-Gurion, Smotrich, these guys might do whatever they feel like and blow up the world. Okay, who cares? God's on our side.
Sunday morning. I'm sitting at my desk working on the intro for my second interview with none other than Noam Chomsky. While I'm preparing for this interview that centers around the situation in Israel, it seems that the region is erupting in violence again. This conflict is going on for 75 years. All the statesmen, all the great presidents and kings that have been involved, not to mention all the Nobel Prizes that have been granted, and all the blood and tears that this conflict has already cost, and nobody has ever come close to a real solution. Not with the Oslo Accords in 1993 and not in Camp David in 2000, not with any of the other initiatives of the so-called peace process. Instead, it seems we are going in the opposite direction. Today, Israel has the most extreme right-wing government in its entire history, and you don't have to be a scientist to predict what that means. It will make an already bad situation for the Palestinian population even worse. If you have any doubts about what I have just said, just look at the recent riots where hordes of militant Israeli settlers, protected by the army, went on a rampage. They stormed into several Palestinian villages and have left a trail of fire, death, and destruction. At the time I'm recording this, that's still going on. The images that float all over social media are eerily reminiscent of the images from Nazi Germany prior to the Second World War. Smashing windows, throwing stones, burning shops and houses, chasing and beating people. And no, I'm not comparing Israel with the Holocaust. But the way things go at the moment, it's pretty safe to assume that the Israel-Palestine conflict will continue to make headlines. For the Palestinians, that's especially bad news because the world's attention is distracted by the war in Ukraine, incidentally a country that also has been invaded, at least partially, by an occupational force. Speaking of which, are there any other parallels? Yes, there are. We have two conflicts that violate international law. We see clearly crimes against humanity, and in both cases we have an uncompromising and illegal occupation, again illegal according to international law. The interesting part is how differently the world is reacting to both conflicts, but that's a story for another day. As behavior analyst, I can tell you that context is crucial when analyzing complex situations. It's also clear that more and more people wake up to the fact that we are not being provided the full picture in any of the conflicts that are going on right now. Contexts are either left out completely or they are distorted to mold public opinion, means your opinion. That's why I have decided to look closer at some of the crises that are going on right now. In this case, I felt compelled to examine the Israel-Palestine conflict. So today's interview with Noam Chomsky is part of an ongoing series dedicated to this very topic. Our channel has already featured 2 separate interviews with Mikko Pelet, both of which are available for those interested in his truly remarkable story. We also have a thought-provoking discussion with the controversial Professor Benny Morris in the pipeline, which we will release in the very near future. If you don't know him yet, check him out, it's definitely worth it. But there's more. I wanted to explore this topic from multiple angles, and I wanted to speak to people with unique vantage points. I don't know if it's sheer luck, but we have a lineup of several interviews already confirmed to be recorded in the coming weeks. Each of the speakers brings a unique perspective to the table, which is not easily accessible elsewhere. And I'm not just saying this as a means of clickbait. But if you do want to stay up to date with all these developments, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so that you don't miss the new interviews when they come out. But for now, let's turn our attention to Noam Chomsky and hear what he has to say about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Professor Chomsky, thank you so much for agreeing to doing this a second time. We have already spoken just after your 94th birthday, somewhere before Christmas last year.
So I'm very pleased. Apparently, from what I can say, from what I can see in the distance, you are still in good health. Is that
Yes.
so?
Keep hoping, but it's working out so far.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. Okay. Professor Chomsky, I did a lot of research in preparation for this interview, which will center around the situation in Israel. Okay. And I have done a bit more than just doing some research. I have interviewed Miko Pelet twice. In fact, the second interview will be premiered tonight. And I have yesterday, incidentally, spoken to Professor Benny Morris. Do you know any of those gentlemen?
To Benny Morris, I've never met him, but I know his work.
Okay. We will come to the new historians in a moment. It's on my list of questions. Okay.
Okay.
So I have had a look at many of interviews and documentaries that you have presented. And of course, I have watched also many discussions where I have participated. And I have 3 examples, if you allow me, just as an intro going into this conversation tonight. Yeah. So the first one had nothing to do with Israel. It was about a gentleman who has about 4 million subscribers on YouTube. It's a commercial channel, how to generate wealth. And you had a discussion about capitalism with him. You probably don't remember. It's about 2 years ago, and you tried to make a distinction between the individuals like Bill Gates, yeah, and the institutions the people work in. And I have your verbatim statement. I wrote it out for me. You said it's a question to this interviewer. Yeah? You ask him, is it impossible for you to break out of this looking at footnotes naively at the individuals and refusing to look at the institutions in which they function? That was for me the most frustrating response that I ever saw from you, right? You spent an hour trying to explain to the person, to the interviewer, that it's not about Bill Gates who built an empire out of his garage, but it's about the institutions where these people work in, right? So that was a very interesting discussion. The second example of 3, the second example is a more recent one. You were interviewed by Piers Morgan, right? And I'm pleased to say that, how should I say this politely, you were no match for Piers Morgan, or the other way around, right? So he tried very hard to counter your arguments, but you were just brilliant. So I recommend everybody to watch this interview. It's easy to be found on YouTube, Piers Morgan, Noam Chomsky, and you find it already. And the third example, the last one, you had also about 2 years ago, I saw it, yeah? It was with a gentleman he's a Jewish Israel rights activist, right? And first of all, he was about a third of your age, yeah? And then he goes, I found this really brazen, he goes into a semantic discussion with the creator of the linguistic theory. So I found this extremely brazen, yeah? Especially because he compared the situation of the Palestinians with the Israelis, so kind of, they suffer to the same degree. Yeah. He also disputed that the Jewish settlements in the West Bank are illegal under international law. I mean, how can you not know that? Yeah. And he repeated a couple of times, it's immoral but not illegal. Yeah. So what I want to say with this is, those are 3 gentlemen who have a massive social media following. But they are, how should I say this politely, they're distributing misinformation, to say it in a friendly way. Yeah. Do you have any recollection of those examples that I've given?
I don't remember those particular examples, but they're characteristics of many discussions. Yeah.
That's exactly why I use them as an example. Because again, in the first example, I saw your frustration. You spent almost an hour to try to explain something which is obvious, yeah, to someone who is in the financial world, and there was just no coming through. Okay.
It's hard to break through dogmas.
Yeah. So what I would like to do, with your kind permission, I have a couple of questions, first loose questions, and then I would like to go into, I'm aiming to go into the relation between the US policies with Israel, so the dependency between US and Israel, because you cannot see the situation in Israel independent of America, if that's okay with you.
Okay, let's go ahead. Mhm.
Good. So first, Israel faces three crises at the moment, and I will list them, and then maybe you can comment briefly on each of them. Yeah. So the first is, of course, Iran, right? So if I read, if what I'm reading is correct, then apparently from particle analysis, America knows that Iran is now about on the 84% enrichment state, when 90% is, the threshold for an atomic bomb. So I read and I saw a couple of interviews. Also, I discussed with Benny Morris yesterday. Israel might feel the need to intervene militarily with Iran in the not too distant future, and because America, they still burn the fingers in Iraq, they're not likely to assist here. So, what's your view on the? Again, very very briefly. I don't want to make this a major topic here, but what's your view on the Iran crisis? On the current?
The first question we should ask is, what exactly is the Iran crisis? It's talked about all the time as one of the greatest threats to world peace. What exactly is it? Is there a country in the Middle East that has nuclear weapons? Well, not according to the U.S. government. U.S. government does not formally recognize that Israel has nuclear weapons. There's a reason for that. If the U.S. were to formally recognize what, of course, it knows and everyone knows, that would bring U.S. law into play. You could ask whether U.S. military aid to Israel is even legal under U.S. law. Is it legal to give military aid to a country that is developing nuclear weapons outside the framework of the Non-Proliferation Treaty? Technically not. That's why the U.S. had a long period in which it had sanctions on India, later on Pakistan, finally got rid of them because it had to find tricky ways to avoid the Symington Amendment and others. So one question is, why are we talking about the Iran crisis, not about the Israel crisis? After all, there is a country that has nuclear weapons. Well, let's proceed from there. Let's concede, for the sake of argument, that it's a crisis if Iran has nuclear weapons. Is there a way to overcome that crisis? Yes. Institute a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. That would eliminate the problem. Is there any difficulty doing that? Let's have a look. The Arab states are strongly in favor of it. They've been calling for it for 25 years. In fact, even threatened to leave the Non-Proliferation Treaty if it's not done. So they're strongly in favor. The Global South is overwhelmingly in favor. G77, so-called, the 130 or so countries that are quasi-aligned in what's called the Global South have been calling for years for a nuclear weapons-free zone in the period. Iran is in favor of it, publicly at least. Could test it, but they say, yes, we think it's a great idea. Europe certainly not opposed to it. So why doesn't it happen? The United States blocks it. Why does the United States block it? Because it doesn't want Israel's nuclear weapon system exposed. So if there's a crisis, we're back to where we were before. The crisis is the U.S. support for the public, but pretended to be questioned, Israeli nuclear programs. That's the crisis.
Okay.
Other than that, you can overcome the crisis.
Yeah. So again, I don't want to spend too much time on this topic. Just one last question. Do you perceive it possible that Israel will attack Iran in the foreseeable future to eliminate Iran's current nuclear program, knowing that the US actually went out of the Iran nuclear deal, right? Is that a possibility?
Well, there's some technical questions which I don't know the answer to. Does Israel have the technical capacity to carry this out without US support? It's very hard to find the answer to that. Second technical question, if Israel were to escalate its attacks on Iran, notice I say escalate because it's been carrying them out for a long time. Sabotage, assassination, and so on. Those are acts of war. But Israel's been carrying them out with impunity because the United States backs it. That gives you impunity, just like the illegal settlements. So Israel might escalate its attacks on Iran, which are criminal, of course. Would they have the capacity to more than slightly set back Iran's programs? Many specialists say they wouldn't have that have almost no effect. Things that are deeply hidden and so on. So there are technical questions I'm not competent to answer. But would Israel go ahead and do it without US support if it could? It's an interesting question. Up until recently, the answer would have been very unlikely. But it's different now because there's a new government in Israel, which is quite different from the earlier ones. It's a government which basically says, we've got God on our side, so we don't care what you think. Well, when you have that kind of government, it becomes unpredictable. Ben-Gurion, Smotrich, these guys might do whatever they feel like and blow up the world. Okay, who cares? God's on our side.
Yeah.
So
we're gonna come to the Israeli government in a moment. It's on my list. Okay. So if I may, crisis 2, and I'm hoping for your comments here. Is there a third Intifada looming at the moment?
Certainly looks like it. I mean, Israel's pushing the Palestinians very hard. The expanding illegal settlements, moving into areas that were even Ariel Sharon promised they would not move into. Highly provocative action, killing many Palestinians. The court is actually approving things like the displacement of long-established Palestinian villages on fake assumptions, like you need a military firing zone right there, not somewhere else. Things are the kind of things that the court has approved for a long time. It's now expanded attacks on Gaza. You don't have so. Sooner or later, the Palestinians may erupt in response. To an extent, slightly happening with the resistance in Jenin and so on. But how far it'll go, nobody could have predicted the first two intifadas. Can't predict this one, but it's certainly getting to a very tense point.
Yeah, and then the third crisis, and this is where we come to the current government. The third crisis is apparently internal, because the government is led by someone who is on trial for corruption himself. Some of his coalition partners were convicted for crimes, right? And now they are trying together to denude the Israeli judiciary from their power. And I'm referring to the battle for the powers within the Supreme Court. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but is that not an internal power struggle, basically between Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews? So if I'm not mistaken, then Ashkenazi, they had 13 from the 15 judges in the Supreme Court, and now they're trying to, reverse the power from the Supreme Court in order for the Israeli government to be completely unhindered from the Supreme Court. Is that analysis somehow correct?
It's correct, and there are many factors involved, like the conflict between the Mizrahi Sephardic community and the Ashkenazi community goes back 75 years. It's not new. I mean, I was living in Israel back in 1953. You could see it right then. And every time you visit, you see it. It's been very clear. Now it's exploding. It's part of the background. Another part is what you mentioned. Netanyahu and some of his cabinet members, or Netanyahu in particular, prime ministers, on facing pretty serious corruption charges. So it's in his interest to weaken the courts so that they can't pursue these charges. But there's deeper factors involved. There's the country has been moving very far to the right for some years. That's a reflection of the occupation. In fact, some commentators now, like I think Amira Haas may have been the first, are describing Israel not a country with a state that has an occupation, but a country with an occupation that has a state. The occupation is driving policy and attitudes and understanding. The younger people in Israel don't even know what the Green Line is, literally. And in fact, if you travel there, you don't see it. You travel on a superhighway from Tel Aviv to Ma'ale Adumim, the illegal settlement established mostly in the Clinton years. You don't see any, you're not crossing a border. You don't see any Palestinians. It's all the system of integrating the valuable parts of the West Bank within Israel, program that's been underway for 50 years, is now creating a seamless greater Israel that excludes Palestinians, takes over whatever's valuable in the occupied terms. And this new government is extreme in this respect. It wants to move into regions that have been left untouched in principle, like Northwest Samaria region, it's called, or the E1 corridor, the corridor that connects Greater Jerusalem with the town of Ma'ale Adumim to the east. The United States for years has been blocking development of that corridor, which would essentially integrate Ma'ale Adumim into Israel. It would also bisect the habitable part of the West Bank. But Israel's intent on doing it has been doing it in all kind of indirect ways for some time, like erecting a police station or something like that. But the new government wants to just open it up and settle it, which would be a pretty serious conflict with at least what has been U.S. policy, which has impeded that. Previous governments always backed off when there was a conflict with the United States. Present government, it's not at all clear that they would. They may just say, we don't care. We'll go ahead anyway.
Yeah.
They're unpredictable government.
The new coalition agreement is quite clear, and I have it in front of me. If you allow me, I will briefly read those one or two sentences. It states, the Jewish people have an exclusive and inalienable right over all areas of the land of Israel. The government will promote and develop the settlement of all parts of the land of Israel in the Galilee, in the Negev, the Golan, Judea, and Samaria, which of course the later refers to the West Bank. So there is no ambiguity here. I mean, I know the coalition agreement is not legally binding, yeah, but there's no ambiguity here what the current coalition government is trying to achieve.
Well, the only ambiguity is whether that's all that they're trying to achieve. Remember that the charter of Likud, major party, Netanyahu's party, which has never been rescinded, it calls for what's east of the Jordan to be part of the land of Israel. The two banks of the Jordan, this one is ours, the other one too. It's the slogan I heard when I was a kid. It's never been rescinded. So do they mean to include Jordan also? Maybe. Probably. They haven't rescinded it at least. So there's that ambiguity. But yes, you're quite right. It's quite explicit. They're essentially telling the United States, get lost. We don't care what you're saying. Other governments were not that brazen. They tried to accommodate somehow to the master.
Yeah, and we know that especially Netanyahu, I mean, I remember the speech he held in America criticizing Obama, of course, right? So he has a track record of not, being very receptive for American influence, right?
Well, but actually, Obama was the first U.S. president, who didn't make any demands on Israel. Every previous president had made demands, which Israel didn't like, but it obeyed to run through them. But Obama was the first who made no demands. Trump, of course, just gave Israel everything it wanted. Biden's more or less keeping to the Trump policies.
Yeah. Briefly, a little switch. I would like to come back to the slogan, which is now 75 years old. And the slogan is, a land without people for a people without land. Now, from a psychological perspective and from a public relation perspective, this is a brilliant slogan, despite the fact, of course, that it's absolutely not truthful. So from your perspective, would you comment on that? Would you like to comment on this slogan? As a linguist, sorry, I forgot to ask. As a linguist, would you like to comment on this slogan?
Not a linguist. Goes back well over a century to the early 20th century. And it was pointed out right away by leading Zionist figures that, of course, it's not true from plenty of people. So they knew it was a slogan that said, people without a country, a land without people means they're not legitimate. We're the legitimate people, even though the tiny group of Jews in Palestine at the time were bitterly anti-Zionist, almost all of them. In fact, their descendants still are. So there was almost 100% opposition to this on the part of the population, including the small Jewish population. But it didn't matter. According to the Zionist movement, it's ours. In fact, there was an old joke among secular Zionists. Said, we don't believe in God, but he promised the land of Israel to us. That's basically the line of secular Zionists, intended as a half joke, but not a joke. And that's been the assumption. You read Chaim Weizmann, David Ben-Gurion, all the leaders, they just insisted on this. The land belongs to the Jews. Other people there are temporary settlers for the last couple thousand.
Yeah, I will come to Ben-Gurion in a moment, but before, I would like to discuss with you the new historians, what we already brief touched on. Yeah, I would like to have a brief overview on your perspective of people like Ilan Pappe or Benny Morris when they kind of started to research that, let's say, the dark side of Zion after 1980s or so, when the Israel military opened the archives. So what do you think about them?
I think they've done very valuable archival research, brought up lots of things that weren't known. There's more coming up all the time. It's a new book that just came out by Thomas Suarez, who's went into some depth on the British archives during the period found out a lot of things that weren't known before. So there's very extensive, in the Israeli archives, a lot of them been closed now. But when they were open, there was a lot of material came out. Benny Morris, Ilan Pappe, others have made valuable use of this. What their own views are is a different story. Benny Morris, for example, has said that he thought that Ben-Gurion's big mistake was not driving all the Palestinians out. They should have carried out complete tihur ethnic purification should have been carried out. But that doesn't affect his historical work, which is very careful. And, like all historical work, you can question it, but serious contributions. Ilan Pappe as well.
Yeah, there was a remarkable article from Benny Morris. It's called "Survival of the Fittest," and this is also where he made the statement that you just referenced, right? So I see that you make a distinction between Benny Morris as the historian and Benny Morris as the person.
Yeah, of course. There can be fine historians who have awful ideas.
Yeah. Okay. Coming back to the discussion about, let's say, one-state solution, two-state solution, or what you call the Greater Israel. Would you care to elaborate?
Well, if you look at the debate that goes on, extensive debate, it's almost entirely between a two-state solution and a one-state solution. What's missing from the debate is what's actually happening. A Greater Israel solution. That's different from either of the two. For the last 50 years, Israel has systematically, carried out a carefully planned program to integrate into Israel whatever is valuable in the occupied territories, but to exclude the Palestinian population concentrations. That's very critical because you have to maintain a large Jewish majority so you can pretend it's a democratic state. So you look at the development programs, they don't include Nablus. That's out. We don't want Nablus. It's not actually like apartheid. We just want to get rid of the population that we don't like. It was not like that. It depended on the black population. But and so you greatly expand Jerusalem, about 5 times its original size, taking in Palestinian villages, develop settlements like Ma'ale Adumim to the east of Jerusalem, and virtually bisecting the habitable part of the West Bank, a northern salient to the town of Ariel, also partially bisects what's left, take over the Jordan Valley on various pretexts, expel the population. It's now mostly Jewish. That's about 1/3 of the land. Connect them further salients, connect them all with highly sophisticated infrastructure. Of course, all the illegal settlements get all the benefits of being in Israel, plus extra ones. They get subsidized. So these are people who live in subsidized villas, pleasant villas out in the suburbs and so on. And all of that slowly gets integrated into Israel, leaving out the Palestinians. Now, in what's called Area C, the area that Israel has total control over, plenty of Palestinian villages. They're separated into isolated enclaves. The best I saw was about 160, surrounded by Israeli soldiers who will occasionally let people out to tend their flocks or look at their olive trees. It's kind of up to the soldier on duty if you want to let a farmer do it. Meanwhile, they're subjected to constant attacks by violent settler youth, hilltop youth, they're called. supported by the IDF. The army either supports them or participates, arrests Palestinians if they try to block it. A constant life of terror, and there's many people killed. You read the few correspondents who cover this closely, like Gideon Levy. Every day there's another atrocity. Meanwhile, take over the Golan Heights, totally, nobody even talks about that. Trump authorized the illegal annexation. Gaza remains as a shooting gallery. You want to bomb and attack and destroy something, just attack Gaza. Prison was worse than a prison. In a prison, at least you have drinkable water, not in Gaza. That's the system that's developing before our eyes. So if we exclude that system from the discussion, something's very seriously missed. As long as the Greater Israel project is being implemented with U.S. support, of course, Israel will never conceive it, even think about the other two. Why should it? It's getting everything it wants. Why should it think about one state or two state? So much of the discussion seems to me pretty idle because it's omitting the most critical thing that's happening. You can have an academic discussion about one state and two state, but if Israel and the United States are not pursuing it and are pursuing a different project, it's kind of idle discussion in my view.
Yeah. We already briefly touched on Ben-Gurion. Yeah? There's some people who call him, and I think it's a euphemism, they call him transferist. So from April 48, Ben-Gurion is projecting a message of transfer. There was no explicit order in writing. There is no orderly comprehensive policy, but there's an atmosphere of population transfer. Again, I think that's a euphemism. Yeah, the idea of the transfer is in the air by his military leadership. Yeah, the entire leadership understands that this is the idea. Now, under Ben-Gurion, the overall consensus of transfer means, shifting population out is created. So this goes back to that time already. And you are absolutely right. Some people say he did not go far enough because he should have expelled all Palestinians at that time. Then today you wouldn't have the problem. So my question is, and that's a question I have also asked Benny Morris, yeah? Do you think there may come a situation in the future where Israel may expel all Palestinians?
They would certainly like to. In fact, Benny Morris is the one who said they should have, that Ben-Gurion's basic mistake was not to get rid of all of them. He realizes, he says, he doesn't deny that that's a terrible crime, but says it would have saved lots of future crimes, but just get rid of the Palestinians. But could there come a time when they would do it? Depends on international affairs. I mean, obviously Europe would oppose it. The global South would oppose it strongly. Would the United States approve it? That's the crucial question.
In which situation, right, might Israel do such a drastic step?
I think it's not likely. Palestinians inside Israel are pretty well integrated into society. They're repressed. It's not equal, but they play a significant role in the society. So to uproot them would really be straight Nazism. And I don't think Israel's ready to do that. And I doubt that the United States would tolerate that. But you can't tell. If Trump was in office, maybe he would.
Okay. Another slightly different question. Is the global public opinion about Israel or about Israel and the Palestinian conflict, is it changing in favor for Palestine?
It's changing in the United States, crucially. So if you go back 10 or 20 years, I'll just tell you my personal experience. I've been giving talks and writing about these issues for 60 years. Up until about 10 or 15 years ago, I used to have police protection if I was talking about them, even on my own campus, literally. Death threats, meetings broken up, so on, with the support of the major community. It all changed radically. Now you can hardly get a hostile question. It's literally, it's a change in public attitudes among the more or less liberal part of the community, the liberal Democrats, where support for Israel used to be a passion, not just something you supported, but fanatically supported. Now there's more support for Palestinians. It's especially true in young people, including young Jews, incidentally. That's a big shift. Support for Israel in the United States has shifted from liberal Democrats to the evangelical community, the ultranationalist right, security systems, police, army, military, tight military connections, and so on. That's quite a big shift. So what happens to Israel is going to depend a lot on the shifts internal to American society. Which of these groups dominates?
We are coming now in direction of my topic in regards to US and Israel, the relation between US and Israel. So I'm not sure if you follow this, but there is a controversy right now on social media in regards to Roger Waters from Pink Floyd. And the presidential hopeful Robert F. Kennedy revoked his support for Roger Waters. Now, my question to you would be, can any presidential candidate become president without the support of the Jewish community?
Well, in terms of numbers, the Jewish community is not that large, substantial, but not huge. In terms of funding, campaign funding, it's way out of proportion to its numbers. And of course, in terms of its role in the ideological system, intellectuals, journals, and so on, it's way out of proportion to its numbers. So it would be an obstacle, but with the shift in attitudes among liberal Democrats that includes liberal intellectuals, it's not so sharp as before. It's only I haven't followed the Waters case closely, I should say, but from what I can see, the charges of anti-Semitism look very flimsy.
Yeah.
Anti-Semitism is thrown around as a weapon in very ugly ways. This goes far back. In fact, about 50 years ago, exactly 50 years ago, Abba Eban, the famous Israeli statesman, foreign minister at the time, wrote an important article in the liberal American Jewish journal, American Congress Weekly journal of the American Jewish Congress, the more liberal Jews. He wrote an article saying the task of Jews in the United States is to show that all criticism of Zionism, by which he meant criticism of his government, all such criticism is either anti-Semitism or neurotic self-hatred if it comes from Jews. So anti-Semitism if it comes from non-Jews, neurotic self-hatred if it comes from Jews. So 100% can't be any legitimate criticism of the Israeli government. He actually picked two examples of neurotic self-hatred. I was happy to be one of them. The other one was I.F. Stone, ardent Zionist. We were the two cases of neurotic self-hatred, some psychiatric problem. Don't bother listening to those people.
You just mentioned yourself the evangelical community. And this community has become a strong supporter for Israel. And I heard you say, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure if I understood this correctly. If I remember correctly, you said they are supporting Israel, but for deeply anti-Semitic reasons. Did I understand it correctly? Yeah, can you explain that?
Well, first of all, the evangelical movement isn't uniform. But if you take a large dominant part of it, the end times movement, the one that has 60 million people reading its books and so on, why are they supporting Israel? Supporting Israel because that'll lead to a conflict with the Arab world. It'll lead to Armageddon, huge massacre, Christ returns. The people who are saved, who accepted Christ, go to heaven. The others go to eternal perdition. Perdition, that's Jews. It's the most extreme anti-Semitic position I've ever heard. Hitler didn't go that far.
Okay. And then we come to the reason why America keeps supporting Israel. And I heard you say, actually, it all started in 1967. Can you explain?
Before 1967, the United States and Israel had friendly relations, but they were not off the spectrum. Israel was getting its arms from France. The nuclear programs, which the US was opposed to, were being supported by France. When Eisenhower didn't like the British, French, Israeli invasion of Egypt, he just threw them out. Israel strongly objected, but couldn't do anything. So there were warm relations, but not overwhelming. Everything changed in 1967. After that, Israel became the darling of the liberal community, enormous, totally different relations with the U.S. government, enormous aid pouring in, and so on. And it became kind of an untouchable issue in American politics. It wasn't before. So what happened in 1967? Well, take a look. There was a conflict going on in the Arab world between radical Islamism based in Saudi Arabia and secular nationalism based in Nasser's Egypt. In fact, it was more than a conflict, it was a war. Egypt and Saudi Arabia were at war in Yemen, serious war. Well, like Britain before it, the United States has always tended to support radical Islam as opposed to secular nationalism for good reasons. Maybe they don't like the rhetoric of Islam, but they're not a problem. The problem is secular nationalism, which might move on towards independence and integration with the third global South and so on. Well, Israel performed a great service to the United States, smashed secular nationalism, strengthened radical Islam, changed everything. Total change in attitude, even attitudes towards the Holocaust. Before 1967, practically nobody talked about the Holocaust. After 1967, it became a huge issue. Holocaust museums in every city, Holocaust courses, Elie Wiesel, so on and so forth. Radical changes across the board, policy, public attitudes, all kinds of things. And that's lasted pretty much until pretty recently. Well, Israel became what is called a strategic asset. It was a base for U.S. power in the region. There is, of course, an Israeli lobby. Some thinks it has influence, undoubtedly, but my own feeling is that if the strategic geostrategic reasons change, the Israeli lobby would just be like some other lobby, Armenian lobby, or something like that. Not overwhelming power. Has overwhelming power because it lines up with American policy and strategic interests. That's my own view. Differ from Mearsheimer and Wolf on this. But uncontroversially, policy changed radically in '67, and attitudes and opinions as well. That part's not controversial. We can ask about the reasons, and I think it remains the case. Right now, relations are very tight. When Israel, in one of its attacks on Gaza, began to run out of advanced weapons to use for destroying Gaza, it appealed to the United States for new weapon supplies. You didn't even send them from the United States. They were sent from weapons stored in Israel, U.S. weapons, for use if the United States decides to carry out some military action in the region. The Rafael military industry is Israel's main military industry. Actually has its headquarters in Washington. That's where the money is, tightly integrated.
I mean, the tendency to support radical Islam goes already back to Britain. So the US actually took this, I don't know, have it over. Yeah. And if we see it as a guard against secular nationalism leading to independence, is that then not pure colonialism? Are we not talking about pure colonialism when we talk about Israel?
Yeah. Britain, we're allowed to admit that Britain was pure colonialism. We're not allowed to admit that the U.S. carrying out this policy that's forbidden. The United States doesn't carry out imperial policy. That's a self-contradiction, whatever the facts are.
If we briefly look at the US, what's happening in the US today, you have massive money printing, which is basically no longer money printing in that sense. You just add a couple of zeros to computers. You have 30 million people living from food stamps. I don't know how many million of homeless people. You have a drug epidemic, fentanyl epidemic. If you look at those images, you have the feeling you're in a zombie movie. Infrastructure, like I think 2 days ago, a massive part of US, a superhighway collapsed. Public transport, healthcare, education, everything is on the decline. Yeah. At the same time, they're building the most expensive flight carrier ever. So, with Israel depending on US support, I mean, I'm always tempted to use a cliche because I know it's not a good comparison, but to some degree it also is. Yeah? The comparison between the decline of the Roman Empire and the American Empire, because it's military overstretch, overspending, and internal corruption. And all three parts you see also happening in the US right now. I mean, you buy literally president. So when you analyze what's in a nutshell, yeah, I mean, I know we could talk about this topic forever, yeah, but if you analyze the situation, what's going on in the US today, and then maybe refer back to Israel, the consequences for Israel.
Well, of course, it's a complicated story, but we have been through 45 years of a major state corporate assault on the population, which is talking about poverty and homelessness. Take a look at this morning's New York Times. There's an interesting article on doctors, professionals, six-figure salaries, suffering from severe mental distress because of they can't take care of patients. They have to spend their time arguing with insurance companies. The medical system is a disaster, hitting even the most privileged sectors, like the doctors themselves. All of this is part of the neoliberal assault on the structure of the society, which has been going on for 45 years. It's hit most of the world in one way or another. Started with Reagan and Thatcher. In the United States alone, just to take one measure, about $50 trillion has been basically stolen from the middle class and the working class and handed over to the top 1%. It's one measure of the class war that's going on. You go back to the 1970s, you look at general social statistics, the United States was not that very different from other advanced societies. Now it's off the charts. Incarceration, medical costs, even elementary things like maternal care. It's about the only country which you don't have it. And people are going into bankruptcy because they can't pay for medical care. GDP is going up, but that doesn't tell you very much. There are good correlations between inequality and social problems. The higher the inequality, the greater the social problems. The United States is just off the chart. It's not even along the standard line. Very high inequality, but much worse social problems. Well, those are internal problems in the United States. It's tearing itself apart internally. The tens of trillions of dollars that are being spent in wars overseas, of course, that's a drain. But so there's a kind of a rough comparison you could draw between the Roman Empire and the American system, but such analogies are pretty thin. There's too many other factors. But I think that your general point is correct. The society's tearing itself apart from inside. And remember that there's only one political party now. The Republican Party is not a political party in any traditional sense. It's been called a radical insurgency by mainstream political scientists. It's not interested in doing anything to help the country, just to gain power and serve wealth. So it's not a political party. Very likely take the next election, which will be a disaster for the country and the world.
If you look at the overall policies, let's say over the last 75 years, again, I'm looking from the outside, I'm living in Europe. It's absolutely irrelevant, Democrats or Republicans. The overall policies that the geostrategic policies that America pushes through is completely irrespective who is coincidentally on power the next 4 years. So the interests that the US pushes through, if it's Clinton or Reagan, there's no difference whatsoever.
There are differences. Fundamentally, they're very similar in many ways. But these small differences translate into major effects in a big power system. So if you look at every Republican administration since Reagan spends lavishly to try to stimulate the economy, to benefit the wealthy, huge tax cuts, big hole in the deficit. Democrats come in, Republicans immediately say, oh, big deficit problem, you can't spend anything. There hasn't been a single budget problem for any Republican administration, the one like the budget conflict that just happened. Every Democratic administration, no Republican administration. It's just open-ended class war. Don't care at all about the public, about the consequences, what happens to the public, anything. Just wealth and corporate power, period. Democrats are not that different, but somewhat different. Democrats are basically a centrist European party. Republicans are off with a fringe of parties with neo-fascist origins, AFD and others. In fact, you can see it at the meetings they have in Dallas recently. The leading speaker was Orban. That's their ideal.
Okay. I have two more topics which are slightly overlapping and which are connected with what I call the downfall of the American empire. One is the petrodollar and one is BRICS. So if we briefly talk about the petrodollar, where America made, well, it's overlapping. Yeah? So America made the strategic mistake to weaponize money. Yeah, very clear in the examples of Iran, for example, or Russia, where they put them off SWIFT. Yeah, but in relation to the petrodollar, if I'm not mistaken, the two African leaders who already started to sell oil against something else than US dollar are both dead. Both Libya's Gaddafi and Iraq's Saddam Hussein. But now Russia, Iran, and other countries are actively building on an alternative to the dollar. And as recently as 2 or 3 days ago, I saw African leaders, I believe in South Africa, openly declaring that they're moving away from the US dollar as inter-African trade currency. And that leads me to BRICS, Brazil, Russia, and so on. Countries that already actively working on an alternative financial system. And if my latest information is correct, then even Saudi Arabia is now on the list of 17 other countries who want to join BRICS. Yeah. So if we can encapsulate the decline of the petrodollar and the rise of BRICS, what's your view on the topic?
Well, it's not going to be easy to switch from the dollar-based economy because it has to be a stable, well-established financial system. In order for an international financial system is based on trust in its stability, on the sound basis of the place where it's located. That's pretty going to be, the United States has enormous advantages, remember. It's the richest country and overwhelming natural advantages, huge economy, total security. GDP is growing much faster than Europe. An effort to replace this won't be easy, but there's plenty of resentment of it, mainly because of the U.S. sanction regime, which is now U.S. sanctions are third-party sanctions. Others have to obey them whether they like it or not. And when they try to resist, the U.S. just kicks them in the face, like the European Union strongly opposes Clinton's sanctions on Cuba, which forced Europe not to deal with Cuba. So they brought it to the World Trade Organization, asked for a judgment on the legality of sanctions. Clinton administration just told them to get lost. Says none of your business. Said explicitly, it's our policy to overthrow the government of Cuba, and it's none of your business. That's called the rules-based order. The World Court just recently condemned the United States for stealing Iran's treasury deposits in the United States. The United States basically told them, none of your business. So they do what they want. And a lot of the world is getting pretty upset about this. And as you said, they are moving towards alternative currencies, alternative arrangements. India is the major one, which has just refused U.S. demands to break relations with Russia. Saudi Arabia has joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China-based. The UAE, the second major oil producer, has also joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's the beginning of a kind of shift from US-controlled Petro Dollar to a more diffuse one involving many sectors of power in the world, what's called multipolarity. So there's a drift in that direction, as you described, but it's not going to be easy to establish some alternative currency system. I think it will happen sooner or later.
What would it mean for the US? How? I mean, it's almost a self-explanatory answer, but what would it mean for the US?
Well, there's, among technical economists, there's a debate about this. And there are many, like Paul Krugman, for example, who thinks shouldn't have any economic effect. Others say it could have a serious effect. I don't know. But it'll have a general effect on the subordination to U.S. demands, like on sanctions. If more countries simply say, we're not going to pay attention to your sanctions, they collapse. So take the sanctions on Iran. Europe doesn't like them, but it's afraid to violate U.S. demands. The big issue that's coming up is with relation to China. The United States right now is trying openly, publicly, no secret, to compel Europe to break its commercial and trade relations with China and with Russia. For Europe, that's a disaster. Europe's already in recession. It's going to deindustrialize. The whole very successful German-based industrial system is based very heavily on resources from Russia and on the China market. If they agree to U.S. orders to break with that, Europe will go into serious decline. So the question is, will European elites and European business agree to go into serious decline, maybe even deindustrialize, in order to follow Washington's orders? That's a big issue in Europe right now. Let's see.
Okay. I have one last question, if I may. I don't want to overstay my welcome. One last one, and it has nothing to do with Israel. Now, you told me long before Seymour Hersh's article about the Nord Stream attacks came out, you and Professor Jeffrey Sachs told me that you thought that the US were responsible for the Nord Stream attacks. And now, a couple of weeks ago, the Kakhova dam was attacked in Ukraine. I was just wondering, what's your vision? Who? Classical question. Who did it?
Doesn't make much sense from any point of view. So it's hard to see a motive. I don't understand why the Russians would have done it. It's very harmful to them. Cuts off water supplies to Crimea, for example. There's some discussion about maybe it would slow down the Ukrainian military actions, but it's not obvious. Would it be from Ukraine's point of view? It's very damaging to the country. So I just have no idea. The case of Nord Stream, there was a very clear motive. It wasn't concealed. The United States was strongly opposed to the Nord Stream pipelines, tried to prevent Germany from proceeding with them, was openly gleeful when they were exploded. The U.S. obviously had the capability, so it looked as if that was the likely explanation. I still think it is. They're now blaming it on Ukrainians, but it looks like a pretty flimsy story. But on the dam, I don't see. It seems that we just can't say. U.S. intelligence blames it on the Russians, but that's routine. It's reflexive.
Professor Chomsky, I am very grateful for the technological progress that allows you to reach an audience which you otherwise would never have reached. I mean, Piers Morgan, who would have thought I would see you on Piers Morgan? I mean, this is just incredible.
That was a surprise. Not usual, but it's fine. There's plenty of outreach through people like you. So what you're doing is great.
Thank you so much, Professor. I wish you good health and many more years.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.